Since they were elected in October of last year, the new Prime Minister has promised more accountability, more transparency, and more openness. And yet, even though he put this in the mandate letters for his ministers, and in fact, he said, and I quote, "We have also committed to set a higher bar for openness and transparency in government." Madam Speaker, why is it that this, one of their first pieces of legislation, in fact, will gut transparency and accountability that was created by legislation that we as a Conservative government brought in? Repealing Bills 377 and 525 sends a very clear message. The Liberals care more about thanking union bosses who helped them get elected than they care about the hardworking union members themselves. These union members are the ones whose dues were spent without consultation. Union leaders need to be held accountable, and they need to tell their members and the public how their tax-advantaged income is spent. Now, as we know, our Conservative government was a strong supporter of accountability. Our Conservative government introduced the Federal Accountability Act and other legislation designed to increase transparency in government agencies and Crown corporations. Bill C-377 was simply about transparency requirements that fall upon entities that enjoy public trust and will allow Canada to catch up with other advanced economies when it comes to financial disclosure. Now, it's important to note that the union funding model itself delivers over $4.5 billion annually to labour organizations in Canada. If you work in a unionized workplace, you're required by law to pay dues. If you refuse, you're fired. Now, this financial power alone should be reason enough to require enhanced transparency, and I'll say a little more about that shortly. Madam Speaker, the workers are forced to make contributions, including those in my riding of Haldimand, Norfolk. They deserve to know how their money is being spent, as do members of the general public who subsidize this revenue through the tax system. Now, it should come as no surprise that a Nanos poll found that 86% of unionized Canadians support greater transparency for labour organizations. And a 2013 Leger survey said that 83% of all working Canadians want our union leaders to follow the example set by other nations' union leaders who joined with government to achieve public disclosure. Now, many of Canada's labour unions politically supported Bill 377. This is what Mark Roomy, a member of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, had to say, and I quote, "Many of my colleagues and I believe our union would be stronger if we had truly open, easy access to our union's financial statements. If there's nothing to hide, then we should be able to get detailed financial statements, which we have fought for years." End of quote. If you're looking for support for these measures, you don't need to look any further than the former head of the AFL-CIO, of course, one of the largest labor organization in the United States, George Meany, who testified at the U.S. Senate Union Disclosure hearing, said, and I'll quote him, "All of these transparency bills are based on the goldfish bowl theory, the concept that reporting and public disclosure of union finances will either eliminate or tend to discourage the abuses the AFL-CIO firmly believes this theory to be sound." Madam Speaker, even a former Liberal cabinet minister, Jean Lapierre, voiced his support for Bill C-377, stating, and I quote, "Frankly, I agree with that bill because I think now every organization has to be transparent. The unions, a lot of times, have acted like they were private clubs. And so I think everybody should go to more transparency, and I think that the initiative is welcomed by the membership and also by the public at large, because why would you hide your financial statements if you get all those tax credits and what have you? So no, I think it's long overdue." End quote. Canadian labour organizations receive over $400 million every year in tax benefits, as union dues are tax deductible, and all revenues are tax exempt. Now, these tax exempt funds, drawn from mandatory dues, are funneled into a wide range of causes, many of which have nothing to do with the collective bargaining process. Canadians have the right to know how their tax dollars are being used to influence public policy alone, since, unlike charities, no constraints are put on the political activities of labor organizations. Sadly, unions are able to force employees for the funding of political parties and lobbying activities that they don't even support. For example, the president of the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union of Canada stated, after the vote to merge his union with the CAW, and I quote, "Can you imagine what it will mean to the CEP, the CAW, when we're the first unionized party that governs the country?" End quote. Well, I think Canadians deserve to know how the so-called super unions plan to use the hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal to achieve that end. Labor organizations, quite frankly, enjoy a more privileged position in our society and economy than any other entity, yet they have no public reporting requirements. Unlike charities, unlike publicly traded companies, federal, provincial, and municipal governments, unlike government agencies, boards, crown corporations, unlike First Nations bands, foundations, political parties, and MPs, senators, and MLA offices. Madam Speaker, C4 also sets out to repeal C525, which was passed by our Conservative government. Bill C525 required the holding of a secret ballot for the creation and for the abolition of trade unions. Now, according to 4 surveys by Labour Watch, support for secret ballots ranged from 86 to 92% amongst currently unionized Canadians. The proposed abolishment of the secret ballot is an attack on the democratic process. All members of Parliament are elected by secret ballot. So why take this away from unionized workers? How can the Prime Minister say that it is undemocratic when he and his entire caucus were elected by secret ballot? The sad reality is, for many union members, that professional union organizers exert unacceptable pressure on employees, give false information, and will even resort to fraudulently signing cards on behalf of the employee in order to get a signed card. Only secret ballot votes can counter such tactics. How can the Liberal government argue that this is what the majority of union workers want? John Farrell, Executive Director of the Federally Regulated Employers, Transportation and Communications, told the Senate, and I quote, "A secret ballot vote is the essence of a true democratic choice and is entirely consistent with Canadian democratic principles," end quote. So what's the problem? What is the issue? They want to be legitimized. So why are the Liberals taking this away? Without any credible rationale, or really any legitimate discussion with union members, the Liberal government is gutting 2 significant pieces of legislation that were a victory, Madam Speaker, for union members.
For workers, exactly.
Perhaps the motive for Bill C4 is quite simple. This is an opportunity to repay union leadership that helped get the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour, an NDP MLA in Manitoba, elected. Madam Speaker, Bill C4 goes against the principles of transparency and accountability. It goes against the fundamental principle of democracy, a secret ballot. Madam Speaker, C4 goes against the wishes of the hard-working union members themselves. And that is why, Madam Speaker, I will be joining my Conservative colleagues in voting against C4.